Hi, my sector class. This is Mr. Tan here. This is how I look like without the mask, and you are watching the video recording for the first lesson of chapter 7. For some of you, this will be the video that you'll be watching for your HPL in week 2, Wednesday. All right, and this lesson, we are finally starting on a new chapter. We are moving on from the Japanese occupation and moving on to life after the occupation. In particular, we're going to focus on how did people respond to British rule resuming after the occupation in this lesson. Okay, move to the next slide. All right, so you see a picture here. This is actually the picture of our old City Hall building. You will still see this exact same building today. It's the old colonial building right in front of the Padang. Every few years or so, when you see a National Day parade, they might hold it at the City Hall building at the Padang. And so here you see one of the first scenes of the British returning to Singapore after the Japanese surrendered. And I'll introduce to you some of the men later in the video. Okay, so I think most of you are familiar with this part of the history. The Japanese surrendered after the atomic bombs were dropped by the Americans, okay, forcing them to end the war and to surrender. So we have Little Boy and we have Fat Man, very innocent sounding names, but very deadly weapons. That being said, today's nuclear weapons is definitely way more powerful than what was dropped on Japan many years ago. So that's why when we talk about, when you hear the news, you know, Russia and Ukraine, Russia putting their nuclear force on high alert, we have to take it seriously, okay, because if anything goes wrong, or it can be very dire. Same for, you know, when you hear of North Korea testing ICBM or intercontinental ballistic missiles, which can be used to equip nuclear warheads to be shot across, you know, the oceans onto another country. It is very serious threat. Okay, yeah, so I digress. So in this scene, you see, okay, the Emperor of Hirohito. He's not emperor. He's actually the representative emperor. I think he's the foreign minister. Okay, and he was signing the official surrender on the emperor's behalf about this warship. I forgot what's the name of the warship, but it was parked outside Tokyo. And you see behind him, there are all the American officers watching on. Okay, and for Singapore, okay, the surrender took place a little bit later because the British took a while to come back to Singapore and assume control of Singapore. So here you see the scene inside City Hall where the Japanese representative signs the document of surrender for Singapore a bit later in the year, 12 September 1945. All right, I'm going to show you this video now. Let me just stop share the video so you can hear the video when I play it. Yeah, I forgot to share the sound now, so it should work now. So let's have a listen.
The British entering Singapore find streets lined with cheering people. They also find prisoners of war, pitiful figures, victims of Jap neglect and brutality. Medical examination shows them to be on the verge of perishing of starvation and tropical disease. Cigarettes distributed amid scenes of rejoicing. Free of Jap atrocity, free men again, and they're deliriously happy, though some can hardly stand up and totter in jubilation. The surrender of Singapore, the Japs filing in to make their submission to Allied Commander Lord Louis Mountbatten. General Itagaki signs in the absence of Japanese Commander Count Terauchi, who pleads illness. The fall of the great Singapore naval base to the Japs was a bitter blow to the British Empire. Now that is reversed as Mountbatten accepts the Jap surrender. A huge crowd of the Singapore population gloats in the abasement of the once arrogant Japs who lorded it here so mighty, and how they have fallen.
Yep, so it's a big turn of events when the British surrendered to the Japanese in 1942 you know, they played very different roles. The Japanese were very proud, the British were humiliated. So now it's the tables have turned, okay, in 1945. All right, so since you are watching this video, I can't make you discuss, but what I really want to highlight to you is you can imagine there's maybe two feelings people will have with the return of the British. On the right, you see many people gathering out in the streets, welcoming the British back, looking at the British flag being hoisted in Singapore once again. So it speaks a lot about the misery, the hardship they faced during the Japanese occupation. But on the other hand, you can also expect many people back then to be more poignant, or they were less excited about it, because life was still very difficult even after the British return. You see on the picture on the left, there's still a lot of devastation left over from the war. Food shortages were a problem, diseases were still rampant, unemployment was an issue. So life was still very difficult, and people definitely, some people definitely did not feel the excitement. Some people, in fact, felt, you can imagine, they will feel a lot of hatred towards the British because they remember what the British did or did not do 3 years ago when Singapore fell to the Japanese. And to them, many of them, the image of British being superior, being the superior race, being the colonial master who knew it all, this image was shattered, okay, the moment they surrendered to the Japanese, the moment they saw the British prisoners of war being paraded in the streets, okay, the moment they saw the British being reduced to skin and bones in the prison camps. All right. So in this lesson, we are going to focus not so much about Singapore, but we're focusing about the external events that were happening around the world, and we are going to try and imagine what impact it has on Singapore. Okay, how did they influence developments in Singapore later? Okay, the rest of the bullet points you see here will be the rest of the chapter, and they will, I'll let you know in class which of the parts are covered in the upcoming WA2 scope. All right, so this is the timeline you see in the textbook. You see that there are a series of events. There's definitely a lot of events that's not listed here, but the textbook is a very useful resource with a lot of helpful things like the timeline, so make full use of it. As a minimum, you should at least read the slides that I'm presenting to you right now, which I will share with you guys on Google Classroom. All right, the first external development you should know about is the weakening of colonial rules in Asia. If I can draw your attention to the three gentlemen you see at the corner, okay, Mahatma Gandhi, Sukarno, Ho Chi Minh, they were the leaders of India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. They are all considered like the father of the modern these three countries, in a sense that they were the ones that led the independence movement. They were the ones that helped to overthrow colonial rule in their countries. So you see, India got its independence in a few years after World War II from the British. Indonesia fought for its independence from the Dutch, and Ho Chi Minh led Vietnam to overthrow their French colonial masters a bit later in 1954 after a long war. And for those people who heard about the Vietnam War, the USA tries to come in and overthrow Ho Chi Minh and his party, but only the USA faced defeat, and eventually Vietnam became fully independent after a civil war. Okay, but that's an extra fact. Now, you can imagine, you can pause a moment and imagine, with all these things happening around that time, 1947, 1949, 1954, Singapore just got its British colonial masters back. Singapore has yet to get any form of independence or power to govern themselves. And here you are, you read the news, you see these men and the people around the world successfully overthrowing their colonial masters. How will this impact people's views in Singapore? What will people in Singapore be thinking about, talking about? What will they be planning to do? Okay, you can pause the video for 3 seconds and think about the mindset before I share with you more what are some of the possible thoughts. Okay, I hope you did pause the video and thought about it, or else it's quite silly. Okay, but anyway, so I can share with you that people, if you are watching all these things happening around the world back then, you will also feel inspired. These people, they are all Asians like you. Okay, these people, they were all ruled by colonial masters from the West, from Europe, and they used to think Europeans were superior. They managed to break this superiority, managed to get independence, get freedom. So you can imagine, for the people in Singapore who did not particularly welcome British rule, who did not have a good impression of British, especially after the Japanese occupation, they will also be considering, can this happen to us also? Can we one day also get our independence from British? Okay, can we finally be the masters of our own country? All right, and this mindset will really lead to inform the developments that happen in the next 10, 20 years as Singapore gradually march towards independence. All right, the second reason you would need to know about is the growing influence of communism. So after World War II, there's a conflict called the Cold War, okay, between the US and Soviet Union. I want to bring your attention towards the map here. You see on the bottom right corner, there's a world map. There are roughly three blocks of countries. Let me try and circle this. You will see there's kind of like a blue team consisting of the US and the Western European countries. So let's call them Team Blue or Team Democracies. But you also see there's a kind of a red team here, formed largely by the Soviet Union and also including China, and just now we mentioned Vietnam. Okay, let's call them Team Red or the Team Communist. Okay, Team Blue versus Team Communist. Now, the war is called Cold War because there was a lot of indirect fighting. Okay, the two captains of the two teams, the US and the Soviet, did not actually fight each other. There was a lot of tension. There was a lot of exchange of unpleasant words. There were a lot of threats made at each other, but they did not actually fight one-to-one head-on. They did, however, you will learn in Sec 4, if you do want to take history, that they fight in many other smaller conflicts like in Korea, in Cuba, and so on. Okay, so it was a Cold War because it wasn't a hot war. It wasn't a direct outbreak of war between these two group of countries. It was not World War III. Today, you get a feeling something like this also. It's a bit of a deja vu. We know about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We know the US, the Western European countries are once again standing up against Russia. And we also know China is kind of neutral, sympathetic towards very clear communism, which I believe are most of you. This is a very simple cartoon to highlight what's communism about and what's democracy. So if you look at the first cartoon, it's about democracy. Could I eat for together dinner? No. Can we eat for dinner? So taking a vote, having a vote is the hallmark, the key feature of democracy. Whereas if you look at the second cartoon, it's describing communism. A mom is asking Calvin to go to bed, forcing Calvin to go to bed, and Calvin complained, shouting, calling his mom a communist. So basically, you can imagine a communist country is not a free country where you can do everything you want. Whereas the democracy, Team Blue, USA and France, you can do whatever you want as long as you take the vote and follow the wishes of the majority. All right. So in a democracy, you can see that usually we get to choose our government. We get to vote for between the choice of multiple parties. So you look at the voting slip here, you can see that there are usually multiple options. Whereas a communist, sometimes they will say, yeah, we are democracy, we get to vote as well. But if you look carefully, in a communist country, usually it's what we call a one-party country, one-party state, where people can only vote between maybe members of the Communist Party. So you don't really get a choice besides the Communist Party. So some people say it's not really a democracy. Okay, but it's debatable. Okay, so some key comparison. You have this in your textbook, page 43, but I'll just briefly show. Okay, you can see the key differences between a capitalist and a communist. So capitalist is it's kind of like a democracy. Democracy, we talk about countries being free. Capitalist, we talk about countries being free to do businesses, being free to work in whatever jobs you can find. Whereas in a communist country, it's slightly different. You learn more about the differences in Sec 3. But for now, what you need to know is a communist country tends to prefer one-party rule, ruled by the Communist Party, whereas a democracy or capitalist country, there's free elections. In a democracy, in a capitalist country, we have private ownership. People get to own property. You get to keep and save up money. Whereas in communists, usually we don't get to own property. Everything belongs to the government. Everyone works for the government. And in a capitalist society or democracy, we talk about making individuals being more important than the entire country. Whereas in a communist country, they tend to say individuals must sacrifice. You cannot vote. You cannot have a free voice. Everything is for the good of the country. So it's very pro-country, pro-community. All right. And you can see why this might appeal to some people, because as I will show you, this cartoon is from your textbook. It's about a story about how communism became popular in the first country called Soviet Union, so also known as Russia, and how the leaders there made themselves really very popular. And how is this relevant to Singapore history, you might say? Okay, because many people in Singapore felt the same as the Russians they felt during when they had this revolution. They were poor, they just finished a war, their situation was very desperate, they want drastic change. So communists promised them change. So in Singapore later you'll see the communists also promised a lot of changes to the people in Singapore, and it made them very attractive at one point in time. All right, so these are the people who are actively trying to promote communism in Singapore. They are basically Team Red. Do you remember the red versus blue just now is on the map? So in Singapore, there are this group of people called the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army. We have learned in the previous chapter, there are people who collaborated with the Japanese and there are people who resisted. And this anti-Japanese army is one of the more well-known resistance force. So after the war ended, there's no more Japanese to resist, right? So they rebranded themselves as the Malayan Communist Party. Many of them felt they agreed with the communist principles, everything to put the country before self, to put the community before self. And the Malayan Communist Party will try very hard to take over Singapore and get rid of the British from Singapore. All right, so the Communist Party is considered an extreme party. They oppose colonial rule. Okay, many people oppose colonial rule. So communism, the Communist Party was considered quite attractive to many people in Singapore. They want to end British rule and set up a communist government. Okay, how do you think the British felt about the NCP? Obviously, not very good since they oppose colonial rule so much. But there's a key difference between Communist Party and ordinary people in Singapore. While many people might oppose colonial rule, the Communist Party was considered quite extreme. That made the British felt very threatened by the MCP. Why is that? Because the MCP, while trying to get rid of colonial rule, said they will resort to any means possible, including violence. Okay, so you see this news article here. Now you might think three workers at a plantation site for maybe I think it's for tin or for rubber, I can't remember. They were shot dead near Ipoh. Ipoh is a place in Malaya, in today's Malaysia, near the north. Okay, the MCP targeted these planters because they thought, you know, these people are very pro-British. They work for the British, so they want to make a statement against the British. Okay, so the British felt, of course, very upset, very offended that the NCP resorted to so much violence. Okay, so the British also end up taking an anti-communist stance. And since the NCP started using violence, the British also did not hesitate to use violence back against the MCP. And it resulted in what we call the Malayan emergency. Emergency meaning the country was declared to be in a state of emergency, kind of like when COVID first hit, there's a lockdown, there's an emergency, and when there's an emergency, the government usually gives itself a lot of power to do very drastic things. So one of the drastic things the British did was to, first of all, to ban the MCP, and second of all, they started rounding up all these MCP members, people who were supportive of the MCP members. They started combing the jungles of Malaya where many of the MCP fighters were hiding, and they drove them out of the jungle. Some of them, if you are not killed, some of them were killed, some of them were driven away out of Malaya into Thailand in the north even. Some of them would have fled the country to far-flung places and never to return. Okay, so ultimately they were defeated in the 1960s, and finally the communist threat was kind of reduced. Okay, so if you summarize, okay, you can see this is the situation of the Malayan emergency. It's the MCP versus the British. It was the fight between spread of communism versus to continue colonial rule. Okay, in Southeast Asia, it was a kind of a war conducted between the two parties. So the British managed to succeed and many Malayan troops were defeated. All right. So the growing influence of communism was one major influence on the British. Okay. And one of it was from the country called China. Okay. And as you know, Singapore back then, there were already many Chinese. So many British were very concerned that communism could actually succeed. The MCP could actually succeed because they have a lot of Chinese in Singapore, and the Chinese in Singapore, many of them were inspired by the Communist Party of China, who set up a communist country. Okay, so there was a lot of fear about communism, and the British, in response to this fear, they thought, before the communists can win over everybody in Singapore, I shall try and do some things that make the people in Singapore happy with me, happy with British rule, so that the communists wouldn't stand a chance to gain power. Okay, so in the coming lessons, you will learn what are some of the things that the British did, what are some of the freedoms the British gave to the people in Singapore to make them happier with British rule, more satisfied with British rule, and eventually what these people get eventually got them closer and closer to self-government, meaning they get to govern themselves, and eventually independence, meaning they are the full country on their own. Okay, in the next slide, okay, I'm going to go through a bit of the essay question, your work. Okay, to complete the essay question using the textbook as well as the helping words provided. Okay, I'm going to just give you a quick view of how the essay looks like. Okay, for those who helping words already given in the main paragraph. Okay, there are also useful phrases for you to use to fill in the blanks. So you need to fill in the blanks here. Okay, so what is one external development? Okay, so to decide which one is the external development, do look at the helping words here. Okay, they give you a hint of which of the two external development we are talking about, either the rise of independence of other country or the rise of communism. Okay, I'll let you figure out which is which, and you have to describe what was the development about, what was happening in those countries, give some details, so use the helping words, and finally explain how these external developments led to the locals resisting British rule. Because remember, the question at the end is asking about how they lead to local resistance against British rule. So do use the helping words, but also I encourage you to use your own words to explain why the people want to resist British rule because of what is happening in other countries. All right, and then there's of course the second paragraph, same thing, some blanks for you to fill in, some helping words to help you. Okay, basically the two main points that we covered today. And yeah, so that's about it. Do give it a try. I'll collect this work when I see you again back in class next week. It's a long week before our next lesson, so I do hope to collect this work from most of you. All right, if you have any questions, some of you will have my number, especially if I created a WhatsApp chat. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any clarifications, and I'll be happy to assist. All right, have a good rest of the HBL, you guys.